Collective memory. Okay, there's many definitions of collective memory. For me, collective memory is as inclusive of any voice as possible, and it's also memory that it's a social construct, right? But somewhere in that social construct, there is a space for that memory to change, because it does. It changes with political regimes. It changes with, with change of the political landscape in general. So collective memory for me isn't a governmental memory. It isn't a memory that's created by institutions. It's a memory that is shared, not created. It's shared by the community. So it means that it's probably fluid, flexible. It will never be the same. So if you think about an event that 5 people can be part of, every single person would remember different things about that event, right? I might remember that you're wearing a red T-shirt. Somebody will remember that the bomb blew up at that particular moment, right? Somebody else will remember what they had for breakfast, or they remember something that happened 2 years ago. Whereas, collective memory, as understood, by governments, is often the one that reinforces, of course, the particular political agendas. So for me, it's more about the communities and getting into those, indeed, what we talked about earlier, about getting into smaller stories, yeah. So how does the camera intervene into creative memory? I think, particularly nowadays, we live in such mediated culture, there's just no escape from that. There's no, you can't hide from the fact that the minute you pull out your camera, you're already representing, right? So I had an example a few years ago when I went to a film festival, and a friend of mine was sitting next to me, and she was filming her own film being screened, and she says, I'm archiving it for the blog, for my website, right? So you think of that sort of a maison abîme, where you keep looking at, images of image, representation of representation upon representation. So I think it again goes back to this question of our own investigation and questioning how we use apparatuses that we operate with, and how we can embed, I suppose, the critique of or distance or our own take on what it is that we're filming in the actual language of the camera, right? And once again, going back to our Disasters of Peace program, it's there as well. That's what we were interested in, artists that develop their own language through, of course, the media they use. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think I kind of got lost in there a little bit.
And
yeah.
This question has like another part that is, why do you present sometimes memory as fiction?
Okay, so memory as fiction. There's memory itself, that's the neuroscientific research, right? Your memory is as good as your last one. So that's proven. Every time you try and remember something, you're actually creating a new story. And thinking of any art form, but I think film in particular, or moving image in particular, really lends itself to that idea, right? So depending on what you had for breakfast, what mood you're in when you try and remember an event, you each time remember it differently. And you must have had experienced it yourself, where sometimes you keep adding things, or you think in hindsight, right? You have that hindsight knowledge. So it happened to Sam and I when we did our residency in Abkhazia, that we mentioned earlier, that we talk to people. I ask people, members of communities, about their dreams. So I asked them to recall dreams, and as it happened, a lot of those dreams in their recollections referred to dreams about the war they had. There was a 1992-3 war between Abkhazia and Georgia. And they were telling me about those dreams, but they were already, because they were speaking from the hindsight, they were interpreting those dreams and adding things. And as one of the speakers realized that, and she said, like, oh, actually, I think I'm kind of interpreting my dream right now, right? So it's, again, layers of representation and interpretation that I think memory is like a sponge. It's like a kind of a, spongy brain that, depending, which way you squeeze, different things will come out at different times, Yeah, that was about it. Yeah, so working with the actual film as a physical object, which, for a variety of reasons, economical being one of them, but I'm slowly moving away from, to a great degree. So it's the idea of the archive, right? So you have an archive in a physical space that's stored there, the nitrate, the film, the 60mm film in particular, which I think maybe that's what you're referring to, maybe the last film. So it's a physical object, is a record of what's been shot on that film, and it's also a record of culture that produced that representation, that produced that film. And the physicality of it, it's just that the films I worked with, in particular for that I Think You Should Come to America film, existed only in their physical form. So in fact, what I did, although I do work with real film, I did actually telecine it, so I digitized it and then I cut it digitally. But there was a moment where there was one particular film that I actually did have to cut physically, and it felt good to sort of cut through the layers of misrepresentation and actually do it physically with a proper splicer, rather than doing sort of digital, almost an invisible cut, if that makes sense. But I think, I'm not a fetishizer of film, so I don't, I wouldn't work with film if it didn't make sense to me to work with film. So indeed, because of the nature of the subject matter that I'm interested in, such as memories, recollections, that does, lend itself. Super 8, for example, lends itself really well because Super 8 was developed as a medium of home movies, right? It was developed to create memories. That was Kodak's slogan at the time. It's a film to create memories, emphasis on create, meaning construct, right? So you very often look at Super 8 films, family films, and most of them, all of those beautiful families running around, you don't see shit that goes on behind the scenes, right? Because that's not what gets recorded, that's not what's presented to the world. Yeah. Okay, so the link between personal and political, that's one of those big questions again. Political, it's an interesting term. What's political? I think everything is political and everything is personal. So I often feel that because of the subjects I deal with, I feel like I don't have the right to tell the story unless I'm also part of it. And somehow my views are not so much maybe necessarily made clear in a film, but somehow I'm implicated in the actual process of making a film. And there are different ways of doing it. You sort of negotiate, different artists negotiate it differently. Some of them literally use the first person, and I do that too. Some of them, you do that through the use of camera, which is how some does that. But that idea that, how do you negotiate your own self within the film, and as an author, as a maker, as a person that constructs an image of something that essentially, you as a maker are responsible for, right? Because you can think about different people that we work with, different communities we work with, but at the end of the day, the decision is ours as artists who are finally putting it together. So for me, yeah, I think personal is always political, and sort of in some ways, I can't imagine, even if you're making abstract work and it's a straight line somehow, I feel it's personal, yeah.